Many thanks to the organisers for inviting me to speak today, and I will be talking about the zooarchaeology of the pre-pottery Neolithic site in southeast Anatolia called Körtiktepe, and about domestication and yes, sorry, go on. So to give a bit of a background, Southeast Anatolia is an important region in the question of early domestication, as it makes up the northernly part of what is called the Fertile Crescent, which is one of the 13 known major centres of domestication worldwide. Here in the Fertile Crescent, the so-called Neolithic founder crops were domesticated, which includes two types of barley, two types of wheat, barley, flax, chickpea, pea, lentil, and bitter vetch. As well as these, of course, are the four most widespread mammals worldwide, these being sheep, goats, pigs, and cattle. And in the lower left-hand corner, you can see a general timeline with the dates and cultural periods that we're talking about. So this time period is generally known as the pre-pottery Neolithic, and this is subdivided into the pre-pottery Neolithic A, the PPNA, the PPNB, and the PPNC. And the domestication of these species are generally thought to have occurred in the PPNB. As well as these cultural changes, we also see a period of climate change from about 12,900 BP, that is before present. In the preceding Epipaleolithic period, we have what is known as the Younger Dryas, which is a return to glacial conditions, with the environment being comparatively cold and dry. At the beginning of the PPNA, we then transition to the Holocene, which is warmer and wetter, and this is the period that we're living in nowadays. The influence of this change of climate on the development of farming and animal husbandry is under debate, and I will return to this a little bit later. So how do we see domestication in the zooarchaeological record? After animals have already been under human control for some time and isolated from wild populations, some changes can be seen in the skeleton. This includes generally a decrease in body size, changes in body proportion, and changes in skull and horn shape. So you have the wild boar and the domestic pig on the right there. Other changes that cannot be seen zooarchaeologically might include changes in behavior, so they become much more tame, and changes in the coat color. And also, for instance, in dogs, you get these floppy ears. These changes, however, take time to develop and require that the animal populations mostly be isolated from the local wild populations. So how then do we recognize the control of animals before we get these changes in size and shape? One way is to study the demographics of the animals that we find. This means the ages and the sex of the animals when they were killed. Hunters prefer to kill animals prefer to kill more adult males, as they contain a lot of meat and tend to be easier to hunt. But if you're raising a herd, it's much more efficient to kill young males in the herd and allow the females to go to adulthood and then reproduce. So one way of finding out the ages of the animals that are being killed to look at the state of tooth eruption. And you see on the left here a series of mandibles going from sort of quite young to almost adult, and also the wear of the teeth. So just like in humans, you have baby teeth, which they then lose and get replaced by adult teeth one by one, which then wear down. And the wear down create these patterns that can be recorded and approximate ages assigned. So you see on the diagram on the right-hand side, an example from Körtiktepe, which is considered to be wild sheep, and you have wear stage E to F, which corresponds to the ages of sort of 2 to 4 years old, and as mentioned in the previous talk, that this is considered an adult. Whereas you have the much later J-Verhoek, which is more concentrated on wear stage C, which is sort of 6 to 12 months. So we're kind of presuming that this is likely the young males being killed And then, as I said, you have the females probably living a bit longer. And these are certainly domesticated sheep. And one way the adult animals that are being killed are male or female is by taking measurements, as males tend to be larger than females. So on the left-hand side diagram, you see measurements from toe bones of wild sheep. And clearly there's more individuals on the right-hand side, larger individuals. So these are likely more males being killed as opposed to the smaller females. So this is indicating that this is from a hunted population, whereas on the right-hand side, you have much more smaller females being killed off and fewer males. So we can assume that this is the result of a young male kill-off pattern. So the females have survived and the males have already been killed off when they were quite young. So Shannon already mentioned this, the pathways to domestication from Melinda Zeta. And here are the three main pathways again, theorized: the commensal pathway, the prey pathway, and the directed pathway. So just to reiterate, we have the commensal pathway, which is when animals that are attracted to human settlements, human refuse, there is an association, a tolerance of each other forms. And after some time, the humans can then start to keep and then breed the animals. And as previously mentioned, this is not necessarily the result of intention. This is sort of a long development. And animals that are considered to have been domesticated this way, we have the dog, mice, cat, and like pigs. We then have the prey pathway, which is how most major livestock animals were domesticated, the sheep, goat, and cattle. And this is after a long time of hunting the animals. The humans then start to manage the herds and then more directly control the herds and keep the animals. And then lastly, we have the directed pathway, which is essentially the fast-tracked version of the prey pathway. We have where the humans are much more consciously working towards domesticating these animals and keeping them for labor, such as in the case of horse and camel. So what was the context in which domestication arose? We have here in purple a number of pre-pottery and Neolithic sites, including Körtiktepe, and they are pursuing actually very different strategies in the PPN. So sites such as Chayono, we have much more pig, whereas some are much more cattle focused, and then some sites such as Körtiktepe are much more dominated by the sheep and goat. So we turn our attention to the PPNA site of Körtiktepe. It should be noted, however, that domesticated animals were not kept here and were never kept here. The site was abandoned before this was, before domesticated animals arrived in the region or developed in the region. So it's a bit of a sort of a tenuous link, but yeah, I hope you'll see where I'm going. But it is a very interesting site because you see that impact of the climatic change that I mentioned earlier. So this transition from the Younger Dryas into the early Holocene. And many people believe that this transition is important for the domestication of plants and animals, but we have very, very few sites where we can actually see this transition take place. So this is a rare opportunity to see the impact of this climate change and how people adapt. So just to introduce the site dates from the second half of the 11th millennium BC to the second half of the 10th millennium BC. It is considered to be likely one of the earliest permanent settlements in the region, and the people lived off hunter-gathering. And as you can see here, there are many wonderfully decorated artifacts, these famous stone vessels found there, but also these carved and painted bone plaques. Also of note is the huge number of burials within the site. numbering over 2,000, making it the largest burial data set for the pre-pottery Neolithic in the Near East. And a number of the bones and the burials showed signs of modification, including cut marks, paint that you can see here, and also being covered in plaster. The archaeobotany shows that clear shift of vegetation from the Younger Dryas on the left to the early Holocene on the right, where you have you go from an assemblage dominated, and then you see the the expansion of the open oak woodland, which is quite sort of typical for the region at the beginning of the early Holocene. So to turn to the zooarchaeology, we have Younger Dryas on left and the early Holocene on the right. And we have a mix of mammals, birds, fish, and then smaller quantities of things such as turtles, tortoises, crabs and mollusks. And I'll just go through them, the major ones one by one. So in the Younger Dryas, we have, this is a graph that is being shown by NISP, so number of identified specimens, and that just means the count of the bone fragments. So in the Younger Dryas and early Holocene, we have this dark grey and the light green, which is the wild sheep and sort of wild sheep and goat when you cannot tell the difference. We also have this light green, which represents the wild goat, but it's much more wild sheep dominated, but the assemblage is really dominated by these wild sheep and goat. And in the light brown, you see in almost equal numbers the red deer. And then you have various other mammals in much smaller quantities, such as the wild boar, gazelle, equids, which are horses and horse-like animals, fox hare and others. And then between the two time periods, you can see this this little increase in the wild cattle, the oryx. And if you switch from NISP to the weight, you can really see the how important this switched is, the increase of the wild cattle to the assemblage, since weight is a little bit more showing sort of actually maybe the sort of percentage of meals almost that people had, sort of the percentage of the diet. And then so we asked, how does this climate change affect the body sizes of the animals? So here are the sizes of the wild sheep expressed through a logarithmic size index known as an LSI. And that means comparing the measurements from one type of bone, you compare the measurements from all of the bones, and then you compare that against a standard sized individual. And this allows us to have a larger sample size. So we have in green at the top, the Younger Dryas from Körtiktepe, and below that, the early Holocene remains from Körtiktepe. And I've done it in these colors throughout the presentation. And in both phases, you can see on the right-hand side of the graph, there's these slight higher numbers, this slight peak here. So this is likely representing that in both cases, you have more males being killed off, and the overall range is about the same. So you're not seeing much of a change in size of the animals over this climatic change. And then for comparison, you have Körtiktepe at the bottom, which is a PPNB site, and these are domesticated sheep. So you can see that size reduction, and you can really sort of see the difference in wild assemblages and the domestic. And then you have the same sort of graph for the red deer. So not all sites have enough measurements to do comparisons, and not all species have enough measurements to do these kind of graphs, even in Körtiktepe. So you see the same sort of thing, this sort of slight more peaks on the right-hand side of the graph, so there's more males being hunted. But maybe with the early Holocene remains for Körtiktepe, you see this slight size reduction in the red deer in the early Holocene. So moving to fish, not all, or sort of most fish are not identifiable down to a species. This is very tricky work to do. So most of them are just fish, or you could say that that they are from the carp family. And all of these fish are freshwater species found in local rivers. If you look at the ones that were identified to species, you don't have many that are identified to species level. So you can't really talk about shifts in species being found. What you do have is that in both phases, the most common kind of species is called the manga. However, sieving was not really done at the site, so there is firstly a bias against fish being recovered at all, but also there's a bias towards much larger species of fish, because some of these can be hand collected, such as the manga. But what you can do is if you take the height of the caudal vertebra in the cyprinids in the carp family, so sort of this kind of measurement, you see that there's a bit of a shift in the early Holocene towards larger fish or larger carp. But this is impossible to really say, is this the result of a larger fish being caught of the same species? So as in the manga were smaller in the Younger Dryas and then they increased in size over time, or whether this is a change in the type of carp being caught. And on the right-hand side of the slide, you see a quick photo of two of these completely massive vertebrae from manga. So in both phases, despite the lack of sieving done, there was a wide range of bird species found, at least 35 different kinds of bird, representing many different environments being exploited, such as water birds, such as the ducks and geese, such as the grey lag goose, which you see becomes particularly important in the early Holocene, in orange there, waders, which are birds sort of generally living around water, doves, crows, various small birds, birds found in grassland, particularly the great bustard, which is important throughout the phases, and then various kinds of birds of prey, in particular the Eurasian eagle owl, which was somewhat more important in the Younger Dryas. So just to put some pictures to those names, you have the great bustard in the middle there, which is important throughout the occupation of the site and found in sort of open grassland. And then you have on the left here the Younger Dryas species, which is much more varied and representing a few different types of environment. And then in the early Holocene, you have that real focus on geese. So to summarize, from the Younger Dryas to the early Holocene, we see a lot of actually continuity. The species that are being hunted stay more or less the same and in more or less the same numbers. But we do see little increases here and there, such as those species that are riverine, that are living around lakes and rivers and living off the vegetation there, such as the aurochs, such as the wild boar. We also see a little increase, but a little increase in each of these species, a little increase in the thermophiles. So these are warm-loving animals, such as those equids, such as the fallow deer and the gazelle. We also see an increase in mammal diversity. So there are more kinds of mammals, or it's not necessarily more kinds of mammals, but there's a more sort of variety. There's less of that sort of extreme focus on wild sheep and red deer in the early Holocene. But you see this real decrease in diversity in the birds. So you suddenly focus in on the geese. And then we also see that increase in the size of the fish being caught. So what does this tell us about the effects of climate change at this Neolithic settlement? We see that there are species associated with an increase in forest and water, suggesting that as a result of higher rainfall, we have more trees and changes in local water bodies, so perhaps small lakelets or changes in the rivers. There's also this broadening of the mammalian diet and a specialization of birds, which suggests that this climate change is leading to a broadening of opportunities where people can make choices in what they want to hunt. But overall, there isn't a great deal of disruption in the local mammals, and they were able to generally adapt to the new climatic conditions. This may suggest that sort of animal keeping that sort of comes in a bit later in different regions is maybe a result of this broadening of opportunities. With this increase in diversity, it allows people to make different choices and to experiment a little bit. And this could sort of indicate that this might be the reason that animal keeping is able to come about. So I referred to a number of publications for this talk, and I would be happy to share any papers, or if you want to send me questions, I'm available by email here. I'm also on Twitter. And yes, again, to say that this is all now in a new research paper, which was published last month, and it's open access. So thank you all for listening. Thank you for the organizers of the workshop again, and I'm happy to answer any questions.